Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. We're your hosts, Cassie and Kendall.
On today's episode, we are talking about anti-racism. Our guest is Dr. Thema Bryant, co-author of the Antiracism Handbook. Dr. Bryant is a licensed psychologist who has worked nationally and globally to provide relief and empowerment to marginalized persons. She is past president of the Society for the Psychology of Women and past APA representative to the United Nations, as well as the current president-elect of the APA. Bryant has been honored by the APA, the Institute of Violence, Abuse, and Trauma, and the California Psychological Association for her contributions to psychology. A professor at Pepperdine University, she earned her undergraduate and doctorate degrees in psychology from Duke University and completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School. Bryant has served as a mental health media consultant for numerous print, radio, and television outlets and is the host of the Homecoming podcast. Hi, Dr. Bryant. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation, and congratulations on the publication of your newest book.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so excited and glad we were able to write it and share it.
Great. So we're going to start off with just a setting question of what is anti-racism and how can someone cultivate an anti-racism mindset?
Yes. So anti-racism is active opposition and engagement in the opposition of racism. So it is more than I acknowledge racism exists. It is more than I don't like that racism exists, but it is a commitment, an ongoing commitment to dismantling and to disrupting racism in its various forms. And so to cultivate an anti-racism mindset is to dismantle and push back against the cognitive distortions, the thoughts that would make it seem that combating racism is either impossible or unnecessary. So we have to push through that so we can actually show up and do the work.
When I hear that it's a commitment, it sounds like there needs to be a lot of awareness involved in that, in establishing that commitment and cultivating that mindset. So when we talk about that, why are CBT and mindfulness effective tools for cultivating an anti-racism mindset?
Yes. So self-awareness is really important in terms of anti-racism. So the cognitive approaches help us to reflect on what have been my ideas, what are my beliefs about racism, and then where did those come from, and examining the evidence. And so if I say, we think about even, values assessment, if I say that I really oppose racism and that I really am committed to racial justice, then I have to reflect within myself, does that show up in my relationships, in my conversations, in my political engagement, in my workplace, in my parenting? So when something is important to me, my life is aligned with the value or the priority. So it requires ongoing self-reflection and also challenging ourselves to learn. A big piece, we often talk about with CBT is psychoeducation. And so for me to learn not only like history around racism, but to learn the ways in which it shows up for me and in institutions and systems. The behavioral piece is also important, and the way the book is set up, first we're dealing with the mindset and then we're going into action. And both are important. I think sometimes people are concerned that if you're approaching racism from that therapeutic space, that it's just about touchy-feely, like feel good potlucks, right? But we know it's not only about shifting my mindset, but then actually doing the behaviors. And I don't have to know everything to get started, but I do have a foundation of knowledge that we provide in the introductory chapter so that people are rooted and grounded in where we fit in this contemporary moment. And then the mindfulness pieces are so important when we think about the principles. One of the key principles of mindfulness is compassion. And so we have compassion for ourselves and compassion for other people, and that can help us to do the work. and also the piece in mindfulness about beginner's mind, right? That I don't run when I'm uncomfortable. And I think in conversations of racism and anti-racism, people can allow their discomfort to make them opt out, right? This feels uncomfortable, so I want to change the topic. But when I have that beginner's mind, that curiosity, I'm able to sit with the discomfort. I have the emotional bandwidth and capacity, the emotional intelligence, and the motivation to be present even when it's difficult.
That's such an important concept and a really good way of putting it and pairing it with mindfulness. And in the early chapters of your book, you talk about critical consciousness. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why it's so crucial for someone to develop in this work?
Yes. So some traditional or Western based psychologists have been trained, many have been trained to look at the individual separate from context, or when they pay attention to context, that the context is just your family, right? So let me know your family history and know you, and like that captures it. And the reality is, we develop and live in the midst of interlocking systems, socializing systems, systems of oppression, and to pretend that those things don't exist and just use a cookie cutter approach, no matter what people's living experience is, their historical, their cultural, their financial reality. It is to provide incomplete care. And so the critical consciousness is helping people to recognize the systems that have shaped them. For example, critical consciousness is a part of feminist therapy. And so, from a feminist therapy standpoint, if I'm working with a woman who has body image issues, I don't just present it as like, how random that you develop these body image
Hmm.
issues, or it must just be because your mother had an eating disorder. That can be a part of it. And yet, to be able to name the ways in which we are bombarded our entire lives with messages, narrow messages about what is beauty and what is required of women, to let that be a part of the therapeutic process is empowering, because it helps people to know they make sense, right? It's not out of the blue that you would struggle with insecurity, or that you would have rage, or that you would feel that there are difficulties trusting others. That given your lived experience and those of your demographic or cultural background, that makes sense.
And I want to go back, Dr. Bryant, to something you mentioned earlier about discomfort. So to start anti-racist work, there's sometimes this feeling of discomfort or guilt, and I wanted to explore what role does that play when you're starting into this work, the guilt or the discomfort, and why can that be such a big barrier to entry for people who want to start their journey on an anti-racist mindset?
Yeah, so important. So many of us are conflict avoidant, that sometimes we want peace when there has not been any justice, that we can be uncomfortable with people sharing their pain. And so when people of color are sharing their experiences, it can make people label them divisive, or you're the problem. So if you would just be silent, we could all be happy. And what that just means is, I don't want to face your pain. I would rather that if I could believe that we live in a just world, and that if you just worked hard like me, then everything would go your way. So, to shift out of the avoidance of conflict, and instead to compassionately show up and be able to hear people's pain, sadness, anger, outrage, disappointment, takes emotional labor. And often marginalized people are doing invisible emotional labor that no one notices. And then, if those who are in pain begin to speak of their pain, it requires those who were oblivious to now do some emotional labor. And so, not a lot of people want to sign up to do labor, but that is what's required if you want to have like real community.
Hmm.
And the piece about guilt is what's important with the guilt part is to not get stuck or immobilized in it, right? So if you say, oh my goodness, a lot of people growing up in school didn't get like the full US history. You know, they might have got a paragraph about Trail of Tears or a paragraph about slavery. And so when they start to learn more, it can feel horrible to be a part of a group that did these terrible things, past and present. And so then some people, you know, there are some who are won't acknowledge it, but then there are those who like, oh my gosh, like this is terrible. Like, and I was, you know, by association, I'm a part of that, or I've reaped the benefit of that. And so, you know, what I say to those who are feeling the guilt is, um, what you want to do is say, and now what? It's not just like, oh, I'm not responsible, but instead, what do I do with this new information?
So I wanted to ask about avoidance behaviors, and how people can identify when they're engaging with those and how they can actively work to not engage in those avoidant behaviors.
Yes. So when we are uncomfortable with what some might call negative emotions, noticing how do we respond in those spaces. And so one way of avoiding is just not showing up. So if in your workplace or in your friendship circle, the conversation goes to racism, like opting out, right? So, oh, they're having this town hall or they're having this meeting that's going to focus on diversity issues, I'm going to skip that. So, you know, you can just like not be present and paying attention to what do I show up for and what do I not show up for, right? So I'm willing to show up for some people around the environment and global warming. Some people I'm willing to show up to save animals. And then some people, when it comes to racism, they're like, oh, I don't want to go, right? So not showing up is one. A second one is when people show up but refuse to speak. So often in these conversations, the weight can fall on people of color to do all the heavy lifting and the talking. And many white participants don't want to say anything. And I will also say for people of color, sometimes we don't want to speak because there can be consequences. You know, when people have decided, oh, you complain or oh, you're playing the race card. So, not being clear, is this an emotionally safe space for me to say what I really think? Or also, you know, there's just the fatigue of like always having to speak up. But if I'm avoiding the topic, I either physically don't show up or I verbally and emotionally check out. It's also avoidant if people are talking about issues and a part of what is happening, a part of what they're describing is related to racism, but we selectively choose what about the situation we want to talk about and we step over the realities of racism. You know, if our minds automatically go to, well, maybe you're sensitive, or maybe what they meant was, so trying to like over explain and justify are ways of avoiding as well. And then I'll say people who will say, I don't want to watch the news, it's depressing. And I get visually, you know, that things can be overstimulating, but then are you reading the news? Like, or have you just checked out because it's too upsetting to you to know that people are in pain and suffering? So, not even being aware of what's happening in the world is definitely avoiding.
And as we talk about avoidance and mindfulness and all these different components that can go into this work, why is taking a psychological approach to anti-racism so impactful? I know there's a lot of different material out there to get started on the journey, but what is really powerful about the psychological aspect?
Yes, I think in a lot of the conversations, when people come, and all the disciplines are important. So, what I say is racism is interdisciplinary. So, to combat it, we need all the different disciplines. But I think many of the other disciplines assume that the problem is lack of knowledge, right? So if I come from a historical perspective, then it's let me tell you the history, and then that's going to shift people. Or legal analysis. Let me show you how this is showing up in the criminal justice, or some people call it criminal injustice system. So the idea that facts will shift people has not always been true. Some people will do an economic analysis, so trying to document the evidence of, the research where we see that people of color having disproportionate poverty and homelessness, even among those who have college degrees. So even when you have the same education, so documenting those pieces that's important. And when we want to shift not only people, but people create institutions and they maintain systems. So if we want to shift those, we have to look at what psychology brings to the table in terms of our understanding of motivation, of greed, of fear, of hostility, of disconnection, of engagement, of unconscious realities, of even we often use the term unconscious bias. So that to shift those things, we need a psychological lens. And I think it also allows us to have some compassion as we're doing the work, because if we don't understand mindsets, it can be very frustrating. And even when you understand mindsets, it can be frustrating. But in order to continue doing the work, it helps to have an understanding about the ways people function and why they might be doing what they're doing, why they may be in denial, so that we can utilize our awareness of those factors to try to bring about transformation.
Yeah, and it feels like it sort of breaks down all the reasons people don't get involved, fear being a big one that you just mentioned. So I wonder if you could talk about why fear is such a powerful barrier to engagement in this work.
Yeah. So people want to be safe. A lot of people want to be valued or validated, approved, and appreciated. And so there's both the fear of an emotional consequence of rejection and judgment, but there's also the very real fear of material, tangible consequences. If you work in the corporate world and people label you as the problem person, it can hinder your advancement. If you point out at your university the ways in which systematically the admissions process is biased, that's going to make people uncomfortable, right? And they may just prefer for you not to be on that committee or for you to
Mhm.
be in the room, because they know you're going to want people to look at the areas in which there needs to be change and growth. And so there are multiple fears that can be happening. Fear on an interpersonal level, fear in terms of professionally or academically being denied resources. And then for those who are actively involved in anti-racism, whether in social media or in real life, we have stalking and harassment. That there are people who will, publish your information online or start harassing you in your social media platform, or ban your books, right? So, that's a reality that my co-author and I had to, talk about even as we were writing and seeing how, things were um, unfolding in the country of the creation of these banned books, books that talk
Mhm.
about racism, and knowing we could end up on that list and making our peace with that.
Mhm. Definitely. And I think one real big fear about, speaking out is at least I can speak from my own perspective is saying the wrong thing or doing more harm. How can we get over this fear, and then how what are some ways to realize and fix it when you mess up and say the wrong thing?
Yes, I appreciate you raising that one, um, because a lot of people will fear that either they will be misunderstood or their ignorance will be revealed or that they will say something hurtful and they didn't mean to be hurtful. And so I think an important piece is knowing you're going to mess up. Like knowing if you're doing this work,
Mhm.
you're not going to get an A. You're not going to be 100%,
Mhm.
and to not let that stop you from showing up. So show up with humility. The example that I give is as a straight woman, when I talk about LGBTQ issues, there are times when people have had to correct me. And for me to have the maturity and capacity to appreciate the correction instead of getting defensive or instead of saying, well, I tried, so I'm not doing it anymore. Right?
Mhm.
So it's like needing people to explain to me. And also, I'm going to say, doing my work as well. So, yes, receive it when people give you the correction, but also not just looking for the marginalized group to come and pour everything to you, but, like getting the book, right? So, people
Mhm.
going out, getting the information and the knowledge. And then, what you hinted at as well is knowing you're not going to get it 100%. And then if someone points out to you that something you said or did was harmful, hurtful, or incorrect, to be humble about it, to be appreciative if it is appropriate to apologize. And of course, as people say, the best apology is changed behavior. So, like, did
Mhm.
I really get it? Or sometimes out of embarrassment, people will start crying and want the person who's marginalized to comfort them, which is not really a good thing.
Right. Right.
So we want to just, sit with my discomfort, like make sure I really get it, that I understand it, so that the same thing doesn't keep
Mhm. And it's not about you. Like, you realize it's not about you.
happening. Mm-hmm.
It's really nice to hear, like, having a little bit of humility and being open to the experience and just recognizing, yes, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
make mistakes, like,
Yes.
and again, just having the willingness to accept that feedback and to do
Mm-hmm.
something with it is huge. And I wanted to talk about, so going off of this fear and talking about values, how they're related. I think when it comes to this kind of work, there's a lot of people who want to get involved. They're on different ends of the spectrum with how they show their participation or their activity. And so how do, like, when people are very vocal on social media, or versus being very active in their community or whatever it may be, how do values play a role in how you confront the fear of getting started, and then where that takes you in the anti-racist work and journey?
Yes. So this is that key component of shifting from the endorsement of beliefs to behaviors, right? So when I think about what are my key values, and those values might be around justice, it may be about fairness, it may be love, it may be community, it may be truth, right? So accountability, integrity. So then I would say, once you kind of figure out what are your key values, to then say, um, given my stated belief that I oppose racism, um, how have my values um, manifested in particular engagement or behaviors, or how have they not, right? If I did not tell you what my values were, but you looked at my life, what would you think was important to me? And while, we don't want to just be subject to other people's opinions of us, it still says something, it communicates something. If all of my time and energy is focused on accumulation of resources for me and my family, and yet I'm saying these other values are my priority, but that's not showing up anywhere in your life. And I appreciate you naming, and what we talk about in the book is there are a range of ways you can be involved. And, I don't create a hierarchy on them because racism is such a huge issue. We need people tackling it in multiple ways. And so some people's way is like marching and protests and boycotts. Some people are advocating for policy change, either in their city or state or in their institution where they work. Some people are school teachers, and so looking at your curriculum of what are you teaching and what authors are you teaching and what are you sharing with kids. Some people do it through their art, what we call artivism. So using my art to make statements to oppose racism. So that could be in my spoken word poetry or in my visual art. And so all of those can be ways of shifting the tide.
So talking about how anti-racism work can be so many different things, what are some common misconceptions about when people hear the term anti-racism?
Yes. So some people, when they hear the term anti-racism, think that these are people, this goes back to the false beliefs around critical race theory, um, believe that people are promoting a false sense of US history, which is not true. The reality is our history, and I say our, right, US history has not been fully taught systematically. So if we only teach heroes and never teach what we got wrong, when people start talking about the ways we got something wrong, for that to be promoted as anti America or that you're not patriotic, I'm committed to truth, right? So if if someone said if you love your parents, you would only say the good things they've done or the perfect things they've done, we know in relationship it is to be seen as a whole, right? That it doesn't have to be rose-colored glasses for me to love you. It's that I need to tell the truth. I need to give the whole picture. So, so one myth around anti-racism is that these are people, or that we are people that are promoting a quote unquote negative view of America or a false view of America. And, everything that is shared in terms of our history is well documented, and it's simply the truth. Another one is that the aim is just to make white people feel bad, including white children to just feel bad. Uh, if people feel bad and nothing has changed, that's not the goal. Just like, or now people are sad and mad, but no systems have changed. So the goal of anti-racism is not looking for an emotional impact, but in a shifting of systems and institutions so that things can be just. That's what the goal is. Um, so those are probably the two main ones that I hear.
it and going off of that second response, that it's action, like
Mhm.
we've said throughout the conversation, like to just be mad or sad to be anti-racist is to take that action or find your way to contribute to that collective, that we've mentioned. And this is a very, I'm sure, a question you get very often, and it can range from many different topics, but specifically when we're talking about race issues, how can we talk about race issues with someone who has a different point of view, than you do? What are some tools or tactics that we can use to have a conversation that will not leave people feeling heated or divided, but can actually be, transformative in views?
Yeah. In my multicultural psychology course, I find the most moving times are of the course are when people tell their personal narratives. And people can't argue with your story, right? When we talk about the disparities in COVID deaths, then you have people who say COVID's not real or the numbers are fake, right? So often from a psychological or a scientific standpoint, we can think like people will be swayed by the statistics. But I have found when people are really committed to not believing that it's an issue, that they're always going to say the numbers are fake, right? Or that the numbers lie. And so some transformative moments can be when people actually share their lived experience. When I was at a prior campus and one of the Black male student started talking about the number of times he gets followed on campus by campus police, the number of times he has to show his ID, and the white students having never had that experience, that they've been the whole time they've been on campus, no one has ever believed they didn't belong there. So this, this is a key moment. And even as I say that, I want to say that people of color can be tired of telling their stories, because what they can say is, well, you benefit from that, that perhaps if you believe my story, you will shift. But did I gain anything from that, or was that just emotional labor? And
Mhm.
so that's why it's important for white people to also tell their stories. So, having a white female student in my class talk about when she posted on her Facebook page that Black Lives Matter, her white grandparents calling her, yelling at her, and telling her she was banned from coming home for the holidays. Right? So this is important for people to hear, that this reality, right, of the cost and the consequences. And then when people share, for them to be met with support, and for others to not just, because sometimes what people do is they'll wait till the meeting or class is over and just one-on-one want to say to you, oh, thank you, that was great. But to make your solidarity public, not just secret.
Mhm. I like that, telling your stories. So I want to talk a little bit. In the book, you talk about white privilege. I was wondering if you could share what it means to divest from white privilege.
So when so first to be discerning, perceptive, aware, so that you see it as it's showing up, and then to refuse to reap the benefit of that privilege. So a very simple example is I was in line at a cafe, and a white woman came in after me, and the store clerk looked up and pointed to the white woman to call on her next, and she spoke up and said no, she was already here. It's a very simple moment. It wasn't like you're a protest. It's just no, like I see what just happened here. Now I could take my benefit and say like, oh, or assume there must be some reason you're being overlooked. Let me, and I now get my Starbucks sooner. It wasn't Starbucks, right? But to say I am not going to be utilized to dismiss or erase a person of color, even in moments where erasing them benefits me.
Mhm.
And as we talk about white privilege, I just had a follow-up question to that. So that was a really good example of, like you said, it's not at a protest, but this is in a very, common life moment of just correcting the wrong and using your privilege to do that. Um, what is the line that is walked between being, as an ally or just in everyday life of being performative with your divesting from white privilege and then doing it in those moments that are, because I think that we've seen a lot of both, um, recently in the last year. And I just wonder kind of what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, the performative allyship is very painful because it reinforces distrust. And so there was a period where all of these corporations, companies, institutions, and individual people were posting either Stop Asian Hate or Black Lives Matter. And then not only slowly but surely did the signs come down, but even our research shows that people were no longer into it. It was like a hot topic for the moment. And now, like, oh, it's not really a big thing. And not only that, but we have research showing where white people said they only said those things or only posted those things because they felt pressure, that they felt if they didn't, then they would be looked at as bad people. And so they're lying. So it's a false allyship. And that's why our psychological piece is important, for us to be authentic. And I promise you, marginalized people would rather be told the truth than a lie. So it's like if you don't like us, say that and be committed to that and speak that. But to pretend to support and really be working to dismantle or to feel that this was pressured, is a betrayal and it's deception.
Oh, definitely. And it's just more hurtful and it just, perpetuates racism. So, how can allies use their platform or privilege to help fight racism? You mentioned the coffee shop example, like that's a quick moment, but how can they use their platforms for this work?
So this is important, and I think a big priority is to do the work in relationship with other white people. Um, I think there has been um, a growth of white people being promoted as anti-racism experts, taking information from people of color, but then being seen as more palatable, more acceptable, and then making a large profit off of that work without any citation or acknowledgement of where'd you get that training, where did you get that information, and who have you brought alongside you? Whose work are you highlighting? Or is it really just now it's a new business stream? It's like overnight, everybody became a DEI expert, right? And it's like, well, where's your track record of, since when? Since when do you do this work? And of course, it's not to say that people can't be new to the work, um, but it's also to maintain, I'm going to say, integrity in the process. But even if someone's not like promoting themselves as the expert, I would just say it is so much easier for white people to say to me as a Black person, Black Lives Matter. It's a very different thing when you're in communication and conversation in groups when I am not present, when I am not welcome, or just when I'm tired, and you to be willing to take the hit and speak up. So like at a faculty meeting, when an important committee was being created, that was actually that year was like the tenure and promotion committee, which of course affects your whole life as an academic. And the associate dean, who was white, noticed that the way the group was being formed, it was going to be all white. And so, without somebody of color having to complain or point it out, he saw it. He said something, interrupted it, said why it was important for us to have this diverse committee, and like made it happen. So, those are our ways of showing up.
And when you talk about being tired, because that's a big part of it, educating people and in the active fight against racism, can you talk a little bit about racial battle fatigue and what some tools are for self care when you are tired and fatigued from having to educate people of a very long fight that they're new to in some cases?
Yeah, absolutely. So racial battle fatigue is that emotional, I'm going to say even spiritual or physical uh, impact of carrying the weight of trying to shift people or institutions, often in places where people are hostile to you and then to the information that you bring. It can be very draining, and the shifts can be very slow. So I think, a part of what helps us is to pace ourselves. So, what we say in the book is it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So, in order to be sustainable, this is like, I say it's a lifetime commitment to doing this work. So, the only way I can do that is if I am not emptying myself every day. So, having that balance of what are the things that bring me joy? What are the community spaces where I do feel safe? Where are the places that I do feel seen? Where are the places where humor is welcome? So, the outrage is there, but outrage alone is not sustainable. And so, trying to nourish yourself in diverse ways. And then I would say, look for the small steps, right? There'll be these moments where you see like a dramatic thing happen, but what is more frequent is like these little moments of growth and like recognizing those. And then I will say also emotionally preparing yourself for the backlash. I think that some people who are new to this work can be easily defeated when they see people pushing back against their efforts. And so, a maturity in this work is knowing that's a part of it. People are invested in keeping things the same. And so when you bring about change on any level, there are going to be people who are fighting to keep things as they are. And so to expect that in some ways makes it less devastating. When I see it, I'm like, of course, right? Of course you're not happy. Of course you want it to go back to the way it was. But, we're committed to doing the work.
Absolutely. And as we sort of start to wrap up here, I want to talk about raising an anti-racist generation. Like, kids are not born racist, like they're taught that. And so that feels like the best way to begin to really make change is to raise an anti-racist generation. And I think a common thing that comes up for people is how early to talk about race with your children. Can you tell us some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So it is important to talk about it early so that people's first experience isn't outside of the home and they were ill equipped and no one ever told them who they are. So, the research shows, as early as 3, kids are, observing and noting and in some cases interpreting the differences. And so if we have not provided that positive racial socialization about their own heritage and about difference and the ways in which, this can be a gift, the ways in which we can have community with each other, and the ways, and letting them know some people, are rude or are mean and will mistreat people who have a different race, who have different hair, different skin color, different eye color, and we know that that's not right. So if we see anybody doing that, we're not going to join in laughing. We're not going to join in teasing. We're going to go and tell a teacher that this is happening, and we're going to go and check on the friend who is being picked on to say, you want to come sit with me at lunch, that you don't have to be here by yourself. So if a kid from, a different country or culture brings a lunchbox and opens it and the food has a different scent, then how do we respond to that? Or to know there are people who have religions besides our religion. And so, how are we respectful and caring? And so it's, yes, developmentally appropriate, um, but silence is not what's developmentally appropriate. So I'll give you an example of when it could be too extreme or when it's not developmentally sensitive. There was a Black History Museum in Baltimore where I grew up, and I returned to the museum as an adult. And like upstairs were like, the first Black astronaut or, inventors and this kind of thing. They had some pieces about slavery, but it was mostly like kind of contributions and inventions. And so in the basement of the gallery, there was an exhibit about lynching. And they had a sign at the entryway to the basement that said something like for either 13 or 16 years and older graphic material. So, this Black mother had these 2 little kids, and she grabbed them by the wrist and said, "You all need to see this." And she took them down there. And I was just like heartbroken, right? As a 7-year-old, need to see like, I mean, it was like image after image of like these lynched bodies. So I don't believe that was necessary. And and it was, it was good she brought them to the museum, yes, but like, let's see visually and the level of graphic detail how much is needed should vary by age.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as we talk about, raising an anti-racist generation and equipping parents with those tools to talk to their kids is really refreshing, kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation where we're talking about the narrative shifting in public education and things like that. So I think that your book will be a really great resource for people looking to equip themselves with those tools to have those conversations. And that is really important. So I just wanted to say that. And as we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts, Dr. Bryant, that you'd like to say?
Yes, I want to say I appreciate everyone who saw the topic for today and tuned in and stayed with us. And I hope that you will get the book and recommend it to your institutions or organizations and even faith-based communities. We have a chapter for that as well, because collectively we can share the load and shift the tide. I think often there are many who believe in the values of justice and community, but are often silent. And so I hope that each person listening will explore ways where you can be vocal in your support. And again, not in performative way, in an authentic way, but it's a lighthouse when other people can see they're not the only one that wants things to be better.
That is a very inspiring piece to leave off of too. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Bryant. It was a really important conversation, and I think a lot of people will get very useful tips and background for the psychological components that are concerned with this work.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. What a great conversation, and thank you for your work.
Thank you both for having me. I really enjoyed it and loved the questions.
Written by two psychologists and experts in race, identity, equity, and inclusion, the Antiracism Handbook will empower you to make your own personal contribution to creating an anti-racist society. You'll find practical, evidence-based tools grounded in psychology to help you recognize and resist racial stereotypes in day-to-day interactions and strategies to help you communicate with family, loved ones, and children about race and racism. You'll also learn skills to help you navigate race in professional workplaces and advocate for anti-racist politics, policies, and practices in your community, civic, and spiritual life. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order.
New Harbinger Publications is an independent employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For nearly 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.
Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information.